1986 181. By Peter Bunyard. Rocks covering the Sellafield pipeline, which discharges radioactive waste into the Irish Sea. Sellafield is the most polluting nuclear installation in the world, and one with the worst accident record, barring Chernobyl. The contamination of the Irish Sea and the Cumbrian coastline has now reached dangerously high levels as a result of a combination of routine discharges and accidental releases from the plant whose true extent and implications have been constantly hidden from the British public. Windscale, now known as Sellafield, is a complex of nuclear installations sited on the western reaches of Cumbria between the Irish Sea and the Lake District. Sellafield's prime purpose is to extract out plutonium and uranium from spent reactor fuel rods and to make it available for civil or military nuclear programs. Indeed, plutonium from Windscale's plutonium piles was used to make the bombs exploded over the Montebello Islands off the Australian coast in 1952, an act which heralded Britain's entry into the arms race, next in line after the United States and the USSR*. The Sellafield site therefore contains cooling ponds for storing spent fuel awaiting reprocessing, silos and special tanks for holding nuclear waste, fuel fabrication plants for manufacturing plutonium oxide fuel for the prototype fast reactor at Dounreay in Scotland, and, in addition to the B205 Magnex reprocessing plant and its B204 predecessor, various derelict reactors including the twin plutonium piles and the steel-domed prototype advanced gas reactor, as well as officially only that plutonium extracted from the Collider Hall and Chapel Cross reactors should be used for defense purposes, and only then, according to Dr. Donald Avery of BNFL, when the original uranium fuel for those reactors had been derived from non-safeguarded sources obtained prior to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Officially too, the plutonium derived from the Electricity Board's reactors is kept in storage on site until required for recycling either in thermal reactors or in the prototype fast reactor. The intention, too, is to win contracts for reprocessing spent fuel from abroad. A contract has already been signed to import Japanese spent fuel, and much of the rationale for building the thermal oxide reprocessing plant, Thorpe, was that it would largely be paid for by overseas customers. 182. An experimental vitrification plant for encapsulating high-activity waste and the excavated site for Thorpe, the next-in-line reprocessing plant. The 450-megawatt Calder Hall reactors form part of the complex, and like the rest of the installations were taken over by BNFL in 1971 when the company was formed as an offshoot of the UK Atomic Energy Authority, UKAEA, and for one organized and deliberate scientific experiment. The military origins of Sellafield have left a double legacy. Not only are operations there shrouded in secrecy, particularly with regard to reprocessing and the quantities as well as quality of plutonium and storage, but little attempt is made by BNFL or its predecessor, the UKAEA, to put its house in order with regard to radioactive discharges into the environment. On the contrary, as has now come to light some 30 years later, discharges of radioactive effluent were purposely increased during the 1950s as part of an organized and deliberate scientific experiment, in order to follow the pathway of various radionuclides through the environment. The man behind the experiments, Dr. John Dunster, was at the time health physicist with the UKAEA, then in charge of the plant. Today Dunster is director of the National Radiological Protection Board, NRPB, the body responsible for recommending the maximum permissible radiation exposure standards for members of the public and for workers in the nuclear industry. In 1958, at the Second United Nations Conference on the Peaceful Uses of the Atom, Dunster told delegates, the intention has been to discharge fairly substantial amounts of radioactivity. The aims of this experiment would have been defeated if the level of radioactivity discharge had been kept to a minimum. He went on to say that the discharges were deliberately maintained at levels high enough to obtain detectable levels in samples of fish, seaweed and shore sand, and the experiment is still proceeding. In 1956, the rate of discharge of radioactivity was deliberately increased, partly to dispose of unwanted wastes, but principally to yield better experimental data. In fact, as a future disclosure in 1964 in Health Physics made clear, the experimental discharge of radioactivity into the Irish Sea began in May 1952, and was continued for several years. The stage was already set for the much greater discharges of radioactivity active waste that were to come more than a decade later with the operation of the B205 reprocessing plant and the accumulation of spent magnetic fuel from Britain's first nuclear power program. An appalling record. Sellafield's record has not been a good one. Various installations on the site have leaked, some for years before being detected, and that after many thousands of curies have run off into the soil. A silo containing the cladding from spent magnetic fuel leaked for at least 4 years before the leak was discovered, by which time as much as 50,000 curies of radioactive waste had escaped, most of it cesium. Some pockets of soil were found to be giving off absorbed dose rates of up to 1,200 rads per hour, enough to cook an unsuspecting individual. Another leak from a building containing high-activity waste was discovered in 1978, by which time as much as 100,000 curies of waste might have escaped. That particular leak was the result of considerable bungling, a line for emptying a sump containing high-level waste being cut and capped when it should have been left intact. To compound the error, the wrong size gauge was fitted, which indicated that the sump was nowhere full when in fact it was overflowing. For once, the Nuclear Installations Inspectorate was openly critical of BNFL, stating that the management had been lacking in the level of judgment and safety consciousness expected. Nevertheless, it did not prosecute the company, opting for the cheapest means of disposal. As we know today, reprocessing spent reactor fuel is a relatively expensive item in the nuclear fuel cycle, especially when proper care is taken to control discharges and to dispose of higher activity waste. As Dunster himself remarked, the rationale behind the discharges of the 1950s was not just experimental curiosity but also to get rid of unwanted wastes. To be able to dispose of waste into the environment, whether sea or atmosphere, was undeniably cheap, and as long as the authorities in question gave their blessing, perfectly legitimate. The Ecologist, Volume 16, Number 45, 1986. To date, authorizations imposed on rates of discharge from Sellafield have had more to do with what the industry has been willing to achieve than with targets set by authorizing bodies such as the Ministry for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, MAFF. In 1968, the UKAEA needed an increase in the authorization for discharge of highly toxic alpha emitters such as plutonium-239 and americium-241. The limit was then 1,800 curies per year, see Table 1, and it wanted 6,000 curies, a threefold increase of £, already considerable amount. 2 years later, in 1970, authorization was given, yet the Fisheries Radiobiological Laboratory of MAFF did not start sampling for transuranics such as americium and plutonium until 1973, fully 3 years later. In 1974, BNFL discovered that corrosion of the spent magnetic fuel in the cooling ponds was contaminating the pond storage water with radioactive cesium, particularly the 137 isotope. MAFF had originally called for a limit on discharges of 10,000 curies per quarter of CaesiUm-137, but BNFL held out for 15,000 curies on the grounds that tighter control would lead to additional costs. In the event, the authorization on cesium was never confirmed either way, which was just as well for BNFL, as by 1977 the quarterly discharge was up to 40,000 curies and the yearly discharge to more than 120,000 curies. Table 1. Radiological units. Unit or quantity symbol. Brief description. Curie C3.7 x 110 nuclear transformations per second Becquerel BQ1 nuclear transformation per second rad 0.01 joules kilograms 100 erg Gray J 1 joules kilograms equals 100 rad dose equivalent H dose x qx. Any other modifying factors. Quality factor Q. Biological effectiveness of radiation rem rad x qx. Any other modifying factors. Sievert SVJ x qx. Any other modifying factors. By the early 1980s, BNFL had reduced annual discharges of beta activity, including CaesiUm-137, to just under half the peak value of 250,000 curies discharged into the Irish Sea during the mid-1970s, when the corrosion problem in the cooling ponds was at its worst. Alpha activity was also brought down, some 1,000 curies being discharged in 1980 compared to as much as 5,000 curies a year between 1973 and 1975. Even so, as the Radioactive Waste Management Advisory Committee made clear in its 1984 annual report, radioactive discharges from Sellafield remained the highest of any nuclear installation in Europe, with certain local fish-eating members of the public receiving up to 69% of the maximum dose level as recommended by ICRP, the International Radiological Protection Commission, and the NRPB. 183. Persistence in the environment. Radionuclides such as plutonium-239, with long half-lives, will, once released into the environment, persist for tens of thousands of years. They are pollutants for all time, and are particularly dangerous on account of their intense radiotoxicity should they be taken up into the body. In the early days, scientists for the Atomic Energy Authority assumed that the plutonium and other toxic alpha emitters discharged into the Irish Sea from Sellafield would be trapped and locked in the sediment offshore. Yet, as Dr. V. Bowen, who had been an analytical chemist on the Manhattan Project and was later at the Woods Hole Marine Biological Station in Massachusetts, pointed out at the 1977 Windscale inquiry, he himself had found that scallops caught off the Isle of Man, at least 35 miles away from Sellafield across the Irish Sea, had a plutonium burden 40 times and more higher than that found in place caught close to Sellafield off the Cumbrian coast. His finding was enough in itself, Bowen argued, to contradict official claims that transuranic nuclides which were incorporated into the sediments of the Irish seas were not available biologically and therefore would not become part of the food chain. Should Isle of Man scallops be consumed at anything like the rates assumed for Windscale Place, then according to Bowen, individual consumers would get as much as 10% of their maximum permissible levels of plutonium from that one source alone. 6 years later, on October 6, 1983, BNFL announced that it would spend £10 million on a program to reduce plutonium and americium discharges down from 1,000 curies to 200 curies. The factors involved in BNFL's decision, apart from public outcry at the discharges, were that the National Radiological Protection Board had come to the conclusion, after further research, that the absorption rate of plutonium by shellfish, including of scallops, was 5 times higher than it had maintained previously, that more shellfish was eaten than was previously thought, and that analytical methods for measuring plutonium contamination in shellfish had improved. In all, the NRPB decided that the contribution from plutonium to the critical group dose should be increased by a factor of 15. But Bowen was not concerned only with radioactive contamination of seafood. The main body of his evidence dealt with ways in which transuranics such as plutonium and americium might find their way ashore. He suggested 3 pathways: plutonium-contaminated dusts that escaped the filter systems in the exhaust stacks of the reprocessing plant, waste storage and fuel fabrication plant, the sediments that washed up on the beaches, dried out and blew away, and the atomization of alpha emitters by the action of waves along the shoreline. Bowen was amazed that the British authorities only began their examination of the inhalation pathway associated with the resuspension of radioactive substances from contaminated sediment. In 1976, even though the Department of the Environment had considered such an eventuality in 1969, just at the time when it was considering BNFL's request for a 3-fold increase in alpha discharges, when the 184 part of the Sellafield complex, showing the prototype AGR and twin plutonium piles, Department carried out a few tests. It found the mean concentration of plutonium particulates in the Ravenglass estuary, some 10 kilometers to the south of Sellafield, to be 10 times higher than that found in the immediate vicinity of the Sellafield site. In November 1983, the Environmental and Medical Services Division of the UKAEA at Harwell reported the results of experiments which mimicked the action of surf on plutonium-contaminated sediment. It found the concentration of plutonium in the spray to be as much as 800 times greater than that of the seawater from which the droplets were formed. Americium was even more volatile, the concentration in spray being some 10,000 times greater than in seawater. The mechanism by which plutonium and other alpha emitters return to shore would therefore seem to have been confirmed. Meanwhile, A.D. Horrell and his co-workers at the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology have found enormous variability in radionuclide levels within a distance of a few hundred meters in the surface silt and vegetation of a grazed salt marsh in the Esk estuary, which itself leads into the Ravenglass estuary. Such variability, For instance, between 20 and 460 picocuries per gram dry weight for CaesiUm 137, 1 picocurie is 1 trillionth of a curie, can lead to considerable errors in evaluating the extent to which the Cambrian coast has become contaminated by the Sellafield discharges. Horile, for instance, found americium levels to range from 4.59 to 232 pci per gram and plutonium-239/240 to range from 11 to 240 pci per gram dry weight. 1 tissues of ewes and lambs that had grazed over the contaminated Ravenglass salt marshes showed varying concentrations of radionuclides. B.J. Howard and D.K. Lindley, also at the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, found as much as a 50-fold concentration of CaesiUm 137 in the liver of lambs compared with the control U and similar concentration factors in kidney and muscle. Up to 100-fold concentration of plutonium was reported in the liver of ewes. Because they are higher up the food chain, human beings are more vulnerable to radioactive contaminant at ion and are herbivores. Some members of the Cambrian coastal community have been found to be avid eaters of fish and shellfish. Thus investigations by MAFF's Fisheries Radiobiological Laboratory, FRL, found that such individuals would consume up to 100 grams per day of fish, 18 grams per day of crustaceans and up to 45 grams per day of winkles and mussels. On the basis of the annual ICRP dose limit for members of the public, FRL calculated that in 1981 the critical group of fish and shellfish eaters would have received 69% of the limit, in 1982, 54%, and in 1983, 51.5%. Just through diet alone. For consumers of seafood caught further away by the commercial fisheries associated with Whitehaven, Fleetwood and the Morecambe Bay area, the dose to the critical group was calculated as 19% of the ICRP dose limit in 1981 and down to 13% of that limit in 1982. For the average fish-eating member of the public consuming seafood caught by such fisheries, the estimated dose for 1983 was given as 1% of the ICRP dose limit. A person spending any length of time on the Ravenglass estuary, for instance, salmon garth fishermen, or on board boats moored in Whitehaven Harbor will be exposed to external radiation. Taking the shielding afforded by the boat hull into account, FRL estimates that such a critical group may receive up to 8% of the ICRP dose limit through that source, and another 4% if they consume seafood. The alpha emitters, including plutonium, coming ashore, will also add to the dose of those exposed. Present calculations suggest that it is 1% of the ICRP limit. Asterisk. Discharges. As bad as the bomb. The potential for plutonium contamination of the environment through activities at Sellafield is considerable, and according to a report in the Gazette Nucléaire, a French newsletter, could exceed the entire global inventory of plutonium deposited from the atmosphere from all the test explosions that have ever taken place. To date, between 4 and 5 tons of plutonium has settled to Earth from such tests, most falling out over the northern hemisphere. Nevertheless, Cambrian coastal waters now show concentrations of plutonium and americium that are some 2,000 times higher than fallout levels, while even the North Sea has double fallout levels on account of discharge from Sellafield into the Irish Sea. In addition, the United Kingdom embarked on a sea dumping program in which solid waste containing considerable quantities of plutonium were ditched in the Atlantic Ocean some 500 miles off Land's End. Between 1949 and 1977, as much as 140 kilograms of plutonium may have been dumped, with another third of a ton contained in 3,000 cubic meters of waste. In the United States, such exposures of members of the public to radiation from man-made sources would not be permitted on a routine basis. There, the maximum allowable exposure from fuel cycle activities is 25 mg, hence 20 times less than that allowed in West Europe. Meanwhile, those most exposed members of the public in Cumbria will have received 4 or 5 times the U.S. limit. The Ecologist, Volume 16, Number 45, 1986. Local people fishing in front of the Sellafield reprocessing plant. Discharges into the Irish Sea have made it the most radioactive in the world, awaiting similar disposal. Meanwhile, between 1968 and 1979, an additional 180 kilograms of plutonium were discharged into the Irish Sea from Sellafield. BNFL's present plans to reduce alpha discharges down to 200 curies and ultimately, When its enhanced actinide removal plant is operational, to 20 curies per annum, will undoubtedly much reduce the alpha contamination buildup in the Irish Sea and Cumbrian silt. Nevertheless, the plutonium waste problem will not have been eliminated, merely transferred, and BNFL will undoubtedly seek to dump the sludges and plutonium-contaminated resins from the actinide removal plant at sea after some form of waste conditioning. There is no other place for it to go. The worst reputation in the world. BNFL has not fared well when comparisons have been made between its own operations at Sellafield and those of comparable plants elsewhere in the world. The closest in type of operation and in plans for the future is Kogama's plant at Cap de la Hague on the Cotentin Peninsula overlooking the English Channel in Normandy. Not only have discharges into the channel from the French plant been lowered by a factor of 8 for beta emitters and a factor of more than 200 for alpha emitters, particularly during the mid-1970s, but worker exposure within the plant has been one-half or less that registered at Sellafield. During 1980, for instance, the average dose to 2,671 workers at La Hague was 0.241 rem, therefore approximately twice the background radiation, while in 1982, one of BNFL's better years for radiation exposure, the average dose for 5,223 workers was 0.64 rem. Another way of indicating worker exposure is to relate it to the quantity of electricity generated from the fuel. Again, the difference between the French and British reprocessing plants, the only two left in the Western world with any commercial pretensions, is telling. Between 1971 and 1975 external irradiation 185 alone at Sellafield amounted to 1.2 man rem per megawatt electrical year and dead for some 4,171 tons of Magnex fuel reprocessed and 120 tons of thermal oxide fuel. The equivalent value for La Hague was 0.51 and dead for 3,944 tons of Magnex fuel and 356 tons of oxide fuel reprocessed. Since 1977, Kogama has managed to bring down both individual doses to workers and the dose-energy relationship at La Hague, the latter being little over 0.22 man rem per megawatt year in 1981. Meanwhile, the man rems per megawatt year at Sellafield for 1982 had been reduced to 0.93. The collective dose for the workforce at Sellafield has remained relatively steady over the years, the reduction in individual dose being achieved by increasing the workforce. In 1982, the collective dose was 3,370 man rems, hence more than 5 times higher than the collective dose at La Hague. Per ton of Magnex fuel reprocessed, BNFL's record at Sellafield has been at least 2 times worse than Kogama's. Peter Bunyard, Evidence to Sizewell Inquiry. After considerable criticism, both during the Sizewell public inquiry and outside, BNFL has embarked on a costly program to reduce its discharges. As much as £190 million was spent on control of beta emitters and cesium in particular, the SIXEP treatment plant bringing total beta down to 30,000 curies when operational, supposedly during 1985. On December 18, 1984, BNFL announced that a further £150 million was to be spent on a new plant which should cut total liquid discharges from Sellafield, including those from the Thorpe oxide reprocessing plant now under construction, to a target of less than 20 curies a year of long-lived alpha radiation emitters, compared with 383 curies in 1983. Annual discharges of mainly short-lived beta radiation emitters should be reduced to a target of 8,000 curies a year, compared with 67,000 in 1983. The result of all the treatment plants working as planned will be, BNFL stated, to bring Sellafield discharges down to a level comparable with Cap de la Hague. Meanwhile, criticisms are still voiced over discharges, such as they are, from La Hague, and over keeping the total down once attempts are made to keep abreast of the spent fuel coming from a never-expanding nuclear power program, and therefore of having to use a number of reprocessing plants in parallel. At La Hague, for instance, Kogama has plans for 2 new thermal oxide reprocessing plants, up to 800 and up 3A, each with a nominal capacity of 800 tons of spent fuel per year. With regard to the emissions from those plants and their effect on the environment, the Casta Inc. Commission, a body equivalent in France to the Royal Commission in Britain, stresses that 1 Krypton-85 will be emitted in its entirety, approximately 11,000 curies per ton for PWR fuel, 2 liquid tritium discharges will increase from some 60,000 curies per year to 1 million curies, a factor increase of nearly 17. 3. Permissible liquid discharges of beta and gamma radionuclides will remain as they are, namely 45,000 curies per year, excluding tritium. 186. And finally, a MAFF scientist loses his job after warning mothers to keep their children away from the Sellafield beaches. Given the expected increase in throughput of thermal oxide fuel to be reprocessed, Kogama will have to improve its control of discharges by a factor of 4. Just to keep abreast of Kogama's expected performance, BNFL would have to improve its containment of beta emitters, including plutonium-241, which gradually transmutes into the highly toxic alpha emitter, americium-241, by 30-fold, and of alpha emitters by some 1,000-fold compared to its average over the mid-1970s. Even if both companies achieve containment considerably better than has ever been achieved before, they will be far from the zero discharges called for by the European Parliament's Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Consumer Protection. In response to the unusually high incidence of cancer in the vicinity of Sellafield, the committee put before the European Parliament a resolution including a demand that the UK government impose a zero discharge of radioactive wastes into the Irish Sea, and that gaseous emissions of radioactive substances, including krypton-85, carbon-14 and tritium, be controlled in accordance with available technology. The committee also called for a ban on the transport of spent fuel until discharges had been brought down to a technically achievable level and only when a final storage place for radioactive waste had been made available. What to do with the waste? Much of the plutonium-bearing wastes remain in various forms on site at Sellafield and in need of conditioning. In 1974, as much as 500,000 curies of alpha wastes were contained in high-level waste storage tanks, in silos stocked with Magnex cladding from stripped fuel elements and in various other radioactive sludges and wastes. The 500,000 curies of alpha waste containers in the high-level waste storage tanks alone must amount to at least 3 tons of plutonium. The aim is to solidify the high-level waste, through vitrification, and then dispose of it. One idea is to bury it in the ocean bottom, another on land. Concern has grown internationally over the use of the sea for the dumping of radioactive waste, and in February 1983 a consultative meeting of parties to the London Convention on Sea Dumping passed a resolution which called for a halt to the sea disposal of low-level waste pending further scientific investigation into the possible effects on man and on the environment. The UK government, although it agreed to a temporary ban on dumping, has made it clear that it sees few obstacles on scientific grounds to the resumption of dumping. On the contrary, if international opposition to dumping could be circumvented or ignored, then it is more than likely that Britain would use the Atlantic for getting rid of most, if not all, its nuclear waste, including pieces of derelict reactors. Even high-level waste could legitimately be dumped if diluted sufficiently in the conditioning material, whether borosilicate glass or synrock, and if the release rates of radioactivity through leaching could be shown to be sufficiently low. Both the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency are in favor of using the sea for dumping, singling nuclear waste out for special favor from all other potential pollutants of the marine environment. In its revised definition of 1978, the IAEA maintains that all waste from nuclear activities could be dumped provided that the release rates met certain criteria and that total quantities of waste did not exceed more than 100,000 tons per annum at any single dump site. As the Political Ecology Research Group, an independent watchdog committee, points out, current regulations will allow a 100-fold increase in beta-gamma activity and a 50-fold increase in alpha. With suitable packaging, the UK could therefore dispose of all its fuel element cladding, sludges and alpha-contaminated waste within a few years, with no effort being required to retard release of the activity at depth. High-active liquid disposal would require demonstration of retarded release rates, otherwise 450 years would be required for waste generated by the year 1985 alone. In 1976, Grimwood and Webb of the National Radiological Protection Board advised the UK government no overriding reason connected with the radiological protection considerations has been identified which would preclude the disposal of suitably conditioned high-level waste on the ocean floor. Meanwhile, the government has been ordering new ships specially designed for dumping nuclear waste from the hull, hence overcoming the difficulties of The Ecologist, Volume 16, Number 45, 1986. Dumping drums of waste over the side when being hassled by members of Greenpeace in rubber dinghies. To counter any such development, the National Union of Seamen has declared its refusal to handle any nuclear waste destined for dumping in the Atlantic. The final straw for the UK government has come with a majority decision at the September 1985 meeting of the London Convention to maintain indefinitely the ban on dumping. Throughout the world, nuclear wastes are now accumulating and no long-term solution for their safe disposal exists. The trend, too, especially among those countries determined to make a stand against nuclear weapons proliferation, is to keep spent nuclear fuel intact rather than reprocessing it. Temporary, engineered disposal sites for the storage of packaged spent fuel are now being constructed in countries such as Sweden. While such storage fails to provide a long-term solution, at least it offers a better alternative than reprocessing. Meanwhile, the contamination of the environment and living organisms continues, whether through routine discharges or through accidents. For the British public and the European community, the spate of accidents at Sellafield and its associated waste dump site at Drigg during the early part of 1986 have been the last straw. The incidents involved the discharge of half a ton of reprocessed uranium into the Irish Sea, an accident with much in common with the discharge of radioactive crud that contaminated 20 miles of beaches in November 1983, the escape of plutonium nitrate through a faulty valve into a building manned by reprocessing workers, a number of whom became internally contaminated, a fire at Drigg, apparently not involving the release of radioactivity, and finally a leak of radioactively contaminated drainage water from the Magnox storage and decanning plant. The Irish in particular have been incensed by the continued polluting of the Irish Sea. Dr. Garret FitzGerald, the Irish Prime Minister, calling for the plant to be shut down while the EC carries out monitoring of BNFL's activities at Sellafield. Some of the strong words against the plant came from the German member of the European Parliament, Undine Block von Blotnitz. Europe is being polluted for the sake of a few jobs, she told her fellow members. The least we can do is tell the UK to close down its dump. As a result of the pressure on the government, the Health and Safety Executive is to carry out a 6-month intense inspection of the Sellafield site. Simultaneously, studies will be carried out to test whether food in the locality has been contaminated. Nevertheless, the government has brushed aside appeals for the plant to be shut down until the Health and Safety Executive has made its findings public, as has been requested by some members of the European Parliament and environmental groups such as Friends of the Earth. As part of general policy, BNFL has consistently underplayed the nature and danger of its accidental discharges, claiming that the general public have not been put at risk. After the escape of plutonium nitrate, 187. Sellafield and nuclear waste. Friends of the Earth's 10-point plan. Reprocessing AT Sellafield 1. Abandoned the construction of the thermal oxide reprocessing plant, Thorpe. 2. Commence the immediate construction of dry storage facilities for spent Magnox and AGR nuclear fuel at both Sellafield and the sites of nuclear power stations. 3. Phase out Magnox reprocessing over a 3-year period in tandem with the construction of dry storage facilities. 4. Reduce radioactive discharges into the Irish Sea to zero, using the best available technology as agreed under the auspices of the Paris Commission, within a 3-year period. 5. Redeploy the Sellafield workforce in line with its amended status as a Center of Excellence for Nuclear Waste Management, Decontamination, Decommissioning and Spent Fuel Storage. Nuclear waste disposal. 6. Construct above-ground storage facilities for low and intermediate-level nuclear waste on the site of nuclear power stations. Such storage facilities to take the small quantities of waste produced by medical research establishments. 7. Suspend the current proposals by NIREX for shallow and deep disposal facilities for nuclear waste, which led to an Amber Alert. BNFL management made a statement that no more than 2 workers had been contaminated, one of whom had received more than the annual maximum permissible dose according to ICRP standards. Later information revealed that as many as 15 workers had inhaled plutonium into their lungs. And with regard to the uranium discharge, BNFL's managing director, Con Alday, claimed that it was a mere drop in the ocean compared with what was already there. Again, he was invoking the discharge, disperse and dilute approach. Yet as X.X. Harwell scientist M.E.J. Guilford pointed out, the truth was somewhat different, the localized dumping of radioactive uranium leading to far greater concentrations than naturally present either in sea water or in the top layer of the seabed. In a letter to The Guardian, Guilford stated, according to Mr. Alday, the Irish Sea already contains many thousands of tons of naturally occurring uranium. A BNFL spokesman also recently stated that the East Irish Sea contains about 1,000 tons of naturally occurring uranium in the seawater and 10,000 tons in the seabed. My own calculations suggest that the seawater contains only 100 tons. Even if I grudgingly accept 1,000 tons in the seawater, I ask myself, isn't the East Irish Sea rather a big place? Surely, a large proportion of the uranium will stay within 100 square kilometers of the outlet for a considerable time. Now, according to BNFL figures, 100 square kilometers of Irish Sea contains only about 5 tons of naturally occurring uranium. My own figures suggest half a ton. Compared with this, half a ton dumped in a single day looks a little more alarming. But, I hear Con Alday say, perhaps not all of the uranium is in soluble form, some of it will fall to the seabed where there is already 10,000 tons. Well, it depends what you mean by seabed. If you mean the top 200 meters of the seafloor, then yes, I agree. 10,000 tons of naturally occurring uranium is about right. But if you mean the top 10 centimeters, where most of the living creatures 188. 8. Phase out the use of the inadequate DRIG disposal site in line with the phasing out of Magnox reprocessing at Sellafield, and severely restrict the range of waste disposed of at the site. 9. Make major modifications to the institutions involved with radioactive waste management. NIREX should be constitute Teradoki representation from the nuclear industry itself, and to include representatives from the Department of the Environment, the TUC and environmental organizations. The remit of NIREX to be widened to include the management of high-level waste. The Radioactivity Waste Management Advisory Committee, RWMAC, to be made more representative of the general public through major amendments to its membership, and made more independent of the nuclear industry and government by having an independent secretariat, the ability to commission its own research, and to have statutory responsibilities. 10. A major research program into future land disposal routes for all nuclear wastes to be embarked upon over the next 10 to 15 years. The findings of such research to be open to full peer review and independent scrutiny, before a planning inquiry commission considers the alternative disposal options. Then I'm afraid the whole of the East Irish Sea contains only 5 tons of uranium, and the 100 square kilometers nearest the outlet contain a mere 25 kilograms. Compared with this, 440 kilograms dumped in a single day looks truly horrific. We have now come to accept deceit and half-truths from the Nuclear Authority. Even Sir Douglas Black, in preparing his report on the spate of childhood leukemia cases in West Cumbria, was misled as to how much uranium had been discharged into the environment between 1952 and 1955. He and his team of advisors were told that the quantity discharged was 400 grams. 2 scientists who worked at Windscale in the 1950s have now revealed that the quantity was at least 40 times greater. And what about other, far more dangerous radioactive pollutants such as americium and plutonium? Can we accept the official figures of the discharges? One would have to be exceedingly generous to give BNFL and other members of the nuclear establishment the benefit of the doubt. The tragedy is we have created a site that will remain dangerously polluted for all time. Gross mismanagement is simply compounding the problem. Notes in the Marine Pollution Bulletin, Volume 12, No. 5 pp 149-153, 1981. S.R. Aston and D.A. Stanners from the Department of Environmental Studies report on similar results. As they point out, 45% of all the 27,478 curies of alpha activity discharged via the pipeline into the Irish Sea between 1968 and 1978 is made up of americium-241, which then gradually comes ashore associated with fine silt sediments brought in with the tides. As a result, The entire range of the coastline from Maryport in the north to Wyre in the south has measurable activity, the greatest values being in the Ravenglass estuary, where sediments from intersections of the estuary reveal a 7-fold higher concentration of americium than has been reported for some Irish Sea sediments. Meanwhile, plutonium levels 60 kilometers to the south of Sellafield in the Wyre estuary appear to be 1/4 of those fought Ravenglass, the transport of the radionuclide taking 6 years from discharge to sweep down the coast. Much of the plutonium appears to be associated with organic matter in the sediment, suggesting that movement through the food chain may be somewhat easier than if it were totally bound up with inorganic matter. Jean Emery holds a Geiger counter to a pile of radioactive mud from the Ravenglass estuary near Sellafield. The mud was dumped in Whitehall as part of a protest. The Victims of Radiation by Jean Emery. The victims of radiation are not just statistics to be wrangled over, as Jean Emery reminds us. To tell about the lives of radiation victims is never easy. Sadly, there are so many cases, and in not having the time to give the full details of every case, you feel you are denying those people something of their existence, their history, their own unique and individual life. Sometimes those who are suffering are too close to us for us to be able to talk about the issue. Sometimes we are the victims. For those who have been contaminated, it is very difficult to convey the silent fears to a world which demands evidence of physical harm before it will react. For those who have the cancers and illnesses, for these people who satisfy the statistical demand or refute the hypothetical cases, it is too late. They are too far gone for our help. In my hometown of Barrow, we have a long history of shipbuilding, building ocean-going cruise liners before the war, but since 1940 we have concentrated on the building of warships and submarines. In the early 60s, Barrow built the Polaris nuclear-armed and powered submarines. We then moved on to the conventionally armed, but nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines, and now we are also to build the Trident submarines. But Jean Emery is Secretary of Corps, Cumbria, opposed to a radioactive environment. The Ecologist, Volume 16, Number 45, 1986. To start my tale, I would like to go back to the early 50s. At that time, Windscale was in its infancy, and the skilled workers required to build the Calder reactors simply were not available from the local rural community. Many men came from the industrial towns of Barrow and Milham to work on the plant. They were so ignorant of the dangers that one wonders how they survived some of the incidents at the plant. The supposed experts of the day were only one step ahead of the workers. Windscale had several accidents in the first few years of operation, but 1952 was the year of the first recorded incident of any significance. In that year, the Windscale management, the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, decided to release a large quantity of iodine-131 via the cooling towers to see the effect of such a release. The only reason we know of this is because 2 of those who were sent out to track the release found large quantities in their own children. All of this was kept secret until recently, under the 30-year rule which governs military installation. We shall probably never know who those 2 innocents were, and we shall probably never discover why their parents lacked the courage to speak out. Bullet. The next major accident was in 1955. Windscale's plutonium reactors had already been fixed over 300 times by robotic operations, but in 1955 a piece of the monitor which scans the face of the reactor had been pushed through the fuel rod enclosures. To fix it needed men to crawl through to the foot of the reactor. 250 men volunteered their help. They were led in this operation by the plant manager, H.G. Davy, that rare creature who was prepared to take the same risks as his men. Many BNFL workers do not know of this accident. In fact, it was Corps who discovered it. No attempt was ever made to carry out a follow-up health survey of the men involved, although the accident must be relevant to many compensation cases. The men were only allowed 25 minutes working time near the reactor. They each received a dose equal to 3 weeks permissible dose. Doses in 1955 were 3 times the levels permitted today. H.G. Davy died of multiple myeloma in 1960. Most people felt that his death could not be due to his work, as they only knew of his involvement in the 1957 accident, and 3 years seemed too short a time for the disease to take its toll of his life. No consideration was given to previous accidents. When the 1957 accident happened, what can only be described as panic broke out. Firemen were sent in without the correct breathing gear. It took 3 days to bring the fire under control. It took 3 days for the authorities to warn the public. 189. Cumbria. The cancer risk. In April 1983, 2020 Vision, an independent TV company, screened the program, Dying for an Answer. This revealed the following health figures. In 1974-1980, in Copeland, SW, Cumbria and Barrow, all cancer deaths were 25 people aged 15-24, or 39% above the expected for the UK, 47 people aged 25-34, or 32% above the expected for the UK, 110 people aged 35-44, or 5% above the expected for the UK, 402 people aged 45-54, or 13% above the expected for the UK. In the Barrow area, all male cancers in general were 60% above the national average. In southwest Cumbria in general, from 1967 to 1977, male cancers were 10% above the national average. Blood cancers in males and females were 12% above the national average. Multiple myelomas were high. 20 females had the disease, 26% above the average, and for men there were 28 cases, 76% above the average. From 1969 to 1978 there had been 643 cases of skin cancer, an increase of 44%. From 1979-80 all cancers, in males and females, were up 22% above the average. Blood cancers were 32% higher than expected, and another 7 cases of multiple myeloma meant that the level of that illness was 60% above the average. In September 1983, the NRPB published a paper showing that the 20 excess cases of multiple myeloma in SW Cumbria between 1974-80 were equal to all the excess cases of multiple myeloma expected worldwide in all radiation workers since 1920. In January 1984, Maryport Council added another problem to BNFL's list. This council had dredged the harbor, in order to build a marina to attract tourists. They had planned to sell the silt to Whitehaven Council for a children's playground. As a result, work by Dr. Richard Scott and our campaigning, we managed to get the NRPB to report on the silt. In it, the NRPB said that the silt could not be used for a playground and that the safest thing to do with it would be to dump it back in the sea. So, the government had to issue a special permit to dump the waste back into the Irish Sea. Non-essential personnel were allowed to go home. Those skilled workers, who were needed, were forced to stay on site. The management drew people's names out of a hat to see who would go into the stricken reactor. Many of those involved have had cataracts, cancers, early heart attacks, and rare diseases of the nervous system. One man who suffered such a disease is Arthur Wilson. He was the man who found the fire and ran to alert the management. Their reply was to tell him, "Don't be so bloody stupid and stop fooling about." Arthur was one of the men who helped to fix the thermocouples to the reactor. He now has a disease of the central nervous system. His doctors cannot diagnose, but most blame it on his part in the Windscale fire. Les Jenkins, who had come from BNFL's Capenhurst plant to help fight the fire, has multiple myeloma. He tells of how he came out of the reactor with his monitor badge blackened. The health physics department was in chaos, and badges and records lay scattered about the room. When Les applied for compensation for his illness, BNFL told him he had never worked at Windscale. It took 6 months of legal wrangling to get BNFL to admit he had worked there. It took national publicity of his case to get BNFL to pay him compensation. He receives £23,000, the price BNFL put on a loyal and brave worker's life. They still deny any liability. In 1957, the public were far more ignorant than the workers. The personal accounts we have of that time are legion. The cancers and illnesses suffered are quite horrifying. One vital witness is Tyson Dawson, who farmed the land bordering Windscale. He tells of how he stood at his farm and watched the people running around the plant, like ants under attack. He tells of how they could taste the cold iodine, and how they all felt tired. The fire started on Thursday afternoon. At 2 a.m. the following Sunday morning, Tyson was woken by men knocking on his door. They told him to destroy all his milk. He lost many animals over the years he spent farming next to Windscale. Some died of cancers, others were born deformed. Some died due to the 1957 190 accident. others from drinking water and eating food contaminated by Windscale's daily releases. 1957 was a worrying time for Cambrians. Of course we did not know the full facts, we just had a gut reaction to anything nuclear. We now know that Windscale released 101,000 times more iodine-131 than the 3 Mile Island accident. Indeed, as the cloud passed over London, 3 days after the fire started, it trebled the natural background rates of the city in 1 hour. An international row broke out behind the scenes as the Dutch government realized what had happened. Actually, it would be wrong for me to give you the impression that I remember the fire. I was around then but not alive. My mother was carrying me when the fire happened, and because she had 3 young children and was pregnant, she was allowed 2 tins of milk a day. My father, who had worked on the building of Calder Hall, was sick with worry that my elder sister and brother would eat fresh fruit on the way home from school. Ann Todd was a house mother at a local school in 1957. She lived in the small town of Broughton-in-Furness. She lost her son through leukemia following the fire, so did 2 other women with whom she worked. All blame Windscale. Kevin Barry Murphy was on holiday near the plant when the fire happened. He died of leukemia in Manchester. When he was 11, some 9 years after the fire, Bob Benson's son was diagnosed too late for treatment to be any good. He died aged 11. He had been on holiday from Barrow at Seathwaite Reservoir when the fire broke out. He drank the water from the freshwater lake. It had rained very heavily on the days of the fire, all surface water in the area becoming contaminated. Yet no one was told to avoid drinking the water. The 1960s brought many more incidents and illnesses, many of which have been revealed only through our research. Contamination of areas outside the plant occurred because of accidents and deliberate discharges. Cancer became the modern TB. People did not want to talk about it. This new plague was too deadly. People thought it was contagious. In 1973, Windscale tried to reprocess some oxide spent fuel from Japan. It was an experiment, and it resulted in the famous blowback incident in which more than 30 workers became contaminated with ruthenium. This is the story of one man caught up in the 1973 accident. He was a health physicist who believed very deeply in Windscale and its purpose. He smelt butex, a solvent bred in the reprocessing of spent fuel, in the room where the reprocessing was taking place. He ran towards the dissolution tanks. He knew the smell shouldn't be there. He knew something had gone wrong. Where was the smell coming from? His badge went black. The alarm bells began to ring. He then did something which went against all his training. He ran back into the plant and made sure that all his work colleagues got to safety. Whatever one thinks about this man, because of what I am about to say, you cannot deny he was a brave man, that he cared about his fellow workers. He went to the medical department for a checkup. He arrived home, late, white-faced and blood-stained. He wore the white work clothes normally left at the plant. The health physics people had tried to decontaminate him. They had scrubbed his chest and stomach until they bled. They thought he had suffered only from external contamination. They had discovered the high radiation readings were coming from inside him. I will spare you some of the more personal details. This man's claim is not yet settled. But I shall tell you of the management's reaction. When somebody is contaminated, they are taken off active work, and because they are put on ordinary work, they lose pay. This health physics man was a close friend of many of the top management. He was sure they would see he was looked after. He didn't have to go through the usual union procedure. He got his extra £2,000 per year, no questions asked. The management took a close personal interest in him. He told them, "You look after me and I won't go talking to the press." Meanwhile, he had kept a detailed account of what was happening to him, what the readings were from his body. He died 2 years later, a wasted and changed man, having collapsed of a heart attack while playing golf. His wife, on the basis of the records he had kept, sued for compensation. She knew Windscale had killed him. She went to see the BNFL doctor. She knew that BNFL had been present at the post-mortem and that they had taken her husband's internal organs for analysis. She also knew that some of the medical people had refused to do the work because the samples were so contaminated. Dr. Schofield, the chief medical officer, told her that her husband's death was not connected with Windscale, as he had died of. The Ecologist, Volume 16, Number 45, 1986. a heart attack. He had received a 300 rem dose in the accident. John Troughton died of multiple myeloma in 1975. His slow and agonizing death made his wife fight hard for compensation. She eventually received £22,000 for her husband, although the only known cause of multiple myeloma is radiation. Joan King, in the first public compensation payment, received £8,000 for her ex-Windscale worker husband's death. There are some 170 compensation cases outstanding at Windscale. Meanwhile, the level of multiple myeloma at the plant is 7 times the national average. Janet Kennedy is 34. She was 6 when the accident happened at Windscale. She was born and raised in Milam. Recently she developed cancer of the leg and breast, both of which were thought to be cured. She now has cancer of the liver. She also understands what is happening to her. She understands cancer. She also understands why she has lost so many relatives at an early age with cancer. She knows Windscale is to blame. Like many people, she accepts the sad, but inevitable, passing of an old relative. She can accept that they have had their lives and that you can only hope to make their last few years as pleasant as possible. But what she will not accept is that so many young people have to die, and all for the weapons program. Janet is a brave and courageous fighter against nuclear power, despite the fact that she is ill. Galina's, like Janet, was a young woman with everything to live for. Her tale is not related to any one incident in particular, but we believe her death was due to many factors. Galina's died when she was 31. She had lived on Walney all her life. This island, just off the tip of Barrow, is heavily contaminated as a result of the marine discharges from Windscale. The channel in between Barrow Island and Walney Island is the worst affected area in our part of the country. The school Glenys went to was next to the hotspot on the channel that is regularly visited is by radiation monitors. Like many Barrow children, she spent a lot of time playing on the beaches and swimming in the sea. When she married, she continued to live on the island, which is hardly surprising as we do have some very beautiful, supposedly unspoiled beaches. Galina's had 3 children and, after 2 miscarriages, she was sterilized when she was 22. In 1977, she was diagnosed as having breast cancer on the milk duct. Her parents were told no more about the issue until she became seriously ill. Their daughter kept quiet to save them from worry. The doctors who dealt with her before her death felt that she might have been saved had she gone to them earlier. Galina's worked in the Vickers shipyard as a cleaner. Her father remembers that on cold winter mornings she would lean up against the warm nuclear waste flasks as they were unloaded in the shipyard. She was one of 4 in a cleaning squad which cleaned out an area of the shipyard belonging to the DTO section. This section can deal with very menial tasks right up to looking after the PWRs on the submarines. Galina's and her friends worked on cleaning up the changing rooms for the men who would come off the reactors contaminated. As they cleaned up contaminated overalls, it never occurred to them that they did not have any protection themselves. Of those 4 young women who worked in that section, 1 died of a brain tumor, age 30. Another was diagnosed as having breast cancer, and when she went into hospital to have the cancer removed, she then collapsed and was found to have bone marrow cancer. She died age 29. Galina's worked up to 6 weeks before her death. On the 27th of November 1981, X-rays showed her to have a secondary cancer of the brain. Her mother can never forget the way her daughter died. Racked with pain, she cried out to be allowed to die. Her mother would press her hands to her daughter's head to help ease the pain. It's as if she thought I could force the pain away. She would cry to God for help. These people now have 3 young grandchildren as a reminder of their own beautiful daughter. In fact, Glenys' mother remembers how, in 1957, when the warning came about the milk, she threw away the milk she had in the house and then went out and bought some more. As she said, "We were so ignorant then, but we've learned our lessons." 191. The Economics of Nuclear Power, by Peter Bunyard. Nuclear power's unique advantage, according to its promoters, is that it can provide mankind with almost limitless sources of cheap energy. In its efforts to prove this, the CEG resorted to an accounting system whose shortcomings were exposed in our CSENE report of 1981. The CEGB was forced to accept our criticisms. Nevertheless, in the Sizewell public inquiry, it resorted to other accounting devices for perpetuating the myth of cheap nuclear electricity. Britain's civil nuclear power program came into being because of the government's determination in the 1950s that Britain should continue to develop its own deterrent while keeping the cost down. The two wind-scale piles, in operation during the first half of the 1950s, were expensive to run and produced no electricity to offset the cost. Consequently, after the 1957 fire in the number 1 pile, the government was quick to order the shutdown of the number 2 pile and leave the production of weapons-grade plutonium to the Calder Hall and Chapel Cross Magnox reactors. Although the public had been led to believe through an intense public relations exercise that nuclear power produced cheap electricity, the reality was otherwise, and known as such both within the government and the newly formed electricity generating boards. Critics of the Magnox program, including Fritz Schumacher, who was then economic advisor to the Coal Board, claimed that by the late 1960s the civil nuclear power stations had cost the electricity consumers and taxpayers an extra £20 millions in 1960 currency per year over and above that which they would have had to pay if the generating plants had been operated on coal. In 1967, the chairman of the Coal Board, Alfred, now Lord Robbins, told the House of Commons Select Committee that the Magnox program had led to the loss of 28,000 jobs in the mines because of the Electricity Board's diminished demand for coal, and had cost £525 million more in capital costs alone that the £225 million and equivalent-sized coal generating capacity would have needed. Faulty accounting. The civil nuclear industry has been heavily subsidized from the very beginning, not only through grants from the Treasury for research and development, but also through the sharing with the Ministry of Defense such facilities as the Sellafield reprocessing plant and the Capenhurst uranium enrichment plant. Moreover, the initial optimism over the likely costs of nuclear power was based on faulty calculations. When planning a new coal or oil-fired plant, for example, the CEGB always took account of site development and central engineering charges, incorporating them into the total capital costs. Yet, the nuclear planners completely overlooked such costs, which amounted to between 5 and 10% of total station costs, when drawing up the designs for the Magnox reactor program in 1953. Interest charges on capital borrowed were also up to 6% by 1961, 2% up from 1954. Such charges affected nuclear power plants, with their comparatively high construction costs, much more than they did conventional power stations. In fact, the capital cost of fossil fuel plant had been coming down spectacularly between 1955 and 1965 from £60 per kilowatt to £30 per kilowatt. To cap it all, the government then decided to reduce the plutonium credit, based on the putative value of plutonium, as fissile material, extracted from spent fuel. Originally, the credit had been evaluated at 0.3 old pence per kilowatt-hour, pkWh. Now, it was to be more than 0.05 old pence, thus worsening, in one stroke, the overall cost of nuclear electricity by 1/3. It is surely of some relevance that Britain was then negotiating to exchange plutonium for enriched uranium and tritium from the United States, for mutual defense purposes, and it might have been embarrassing if the CEGB had received credit for such an exchange. C. P.201. Rigging the cost. The original undervaluation of the cost of nuclear electricity established a pattern of rigging the cost so that nuclear power would be seen publicly to be a valid competitor with other forms of electricity generation. For instance, during the mid and late 1970s, the CEGB 192 announced that electricity from its Magnox reactors was cheaper than that from other generators. The board's nuclear power stations produced 11.4% of the electricity supplied by CEGB power stations during the year, and the electricity they produced was the cheapest on this system, the CEGB proclaimed in its 1979-80 annual report. In Appendix 3 of that same report, the CEGB indicated that electricity generated by the Magnox stations had cost 1.3p/kWh, while that from coal-fired and oil-fired stations respectively had cost 1.56 and 1.93p/kWh. In the following annual report, that for 1980-81, the CEGB indicated that electricity from Magnox stations was 0.2p/kWh cheaper than electricity from coal-fired stations. Electricity from the new advanced gas-cooled reactors, AGRs, was said to be 0.4p/kWh cheaper. As Dr. Colin Sweet shows in his book The Price of Nuclear Power, the costing of electricity from the CEGB's Magnox stations had gone completely awry. Conventional thinking on nuclear power had it that the high capital costs of nuclear power stations would be more than offset by cheap nuclear fuel cycle costs, the overall cost being cheaper than the capital and fuel cost components of coal-fired stations. For instance, in the mid-1970s, Sir John Hill, then chairman of the UK Atomic Energy Authority, stated that while capital and operation charges for a nuclear power station were 0.41p/kWh, fuel costs were just 1/5 of the total, 0.12p/kWh. But during the latter part of the 1970s, nuclear fuel costs began to soar, primarily because of sharp increase in reprocessing charges, and by 1979-80, according to the CEGB's own statistical yearbook, they had reached more than 90% of total generating costs. Thus of the 1.3p/kWh given for Magnox generating costs, 1.19 were fuel costs. In effect, the published figures showed that while fuel costs had increased eightfold, capital and operating costs had decreased by a factor of nearly 3, falling from 0.28p/kWh in 1971-72 to 0.LLp/kWh in 1979-80.